So you're focusing a lot about mental health and vulnerability and just being very
Yeah.
real. So why the shift? And I think it's such an important topic, and I applaud you for bringing it up, but why the shift?
Yeah, thank you. I have been talking about low carb diets since 2005.
Okay.
There's only ways you tell people cut your carbs and eat real food, Judy. So, and for me, it's natural progression. I have done a lot of personal work with childhood trauma, my own childhood trauma. I was beaten physically as a teenager and berated emotionally, and it lingered for a very long time in my life. And I always wondered, why did I get big? You know, you start trying to look for root causes. How did I get to be obese? How did I get insulin resistant? It didn't just happen. Yes, I had family members that had similar issues, but it can't just be a genetic component. So for me, digging deeper and realizing, whoa, there are stressors in our life. There's things that can happen outside of the food that you eat that impact your weight and your health. And actually, there's been some really sophisticated studies done looking at the connection between things like childhood trauma and your weight and health issues later in life, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, all the things that we attribute to a bad diet, which bad diet did contribute, but you ate the bad diet to cover up the pain of the emotional stuff that you dealt with from your trauma. So it's so interrelated, but it's a different course because people don't want to talk about those things. And one thing that people know about Jimmy Moore, I go where nobody wants to go because, look, we need to talk about them. And if I talk about them prominently, then people are like, oh, wow, Jimmy's talking about it. Now I feel comfortable talking about it. And I've seen this wonderful kind of eyes wide open people over the last year and a half since I came back from my sabbatical, which, by the way, 6 months away. It was so good. I had gone 15 years straight without a break.
Wow.
And then I 6 months and I come back and I'm just like spitfire. Let's just tell the world about emotional health, mental health, dealing with trauma, being the real you, all the things that I talk about now. So it was so cathartic for me because, quite frankly, I was getting worn down by all the negativity that's out there online. And an influencer, you know what I'm talking about. And I needed that. And it kind of rejuvenated me of refinding my purpose again after all these years.
That's so important. And I'm really appreciative that you are sharing this. For me, I went carnivore because I healed with it, my eating disorder, and then and my bouts of depression. And then also it helped me to get closer to my faith. So I think a lot of that is really like a focus on nutrition, but also the mental health side. And I think it's so important to take that self-care, but also be really honest. I have a lot of clients that do a lot of healing with the meat-based diet. They follow my regimens and they do all these things and they're right there at kind of optimal health. But then I figure out, oh, they have some trauma from their past. And by not addressing that, their body is still in kind of this fight or flight mode that they're not really aware of. But, and then you get to a point where they need to go to therapy and work on that trauma, which is stuff that people don't want to work on, right? It's easier to say, hey, what do I need to eat? Tell me what to eat every day and I'll do that. But I don't want to talk about past hurts.
Well, look, there's a lot of shame with past hurts. And so I didn't want to talk about my dad beating the crap out of me and throwing my head into walls, which, by the way, stupid ketosis brain remembers all of that. So I've got one of those brains that I don't forget. I've got little movies that play in my head all the time. So I can physically, literally in my mind's eye, see those things happening. Even right now, as I'm recalling those stories, I don't get a visceral reaction because I've dealt with what it is. It's just a reminder. And I never want to forget because it helps people when I can talk about these things. But there's so much shame involved. People don't want to get them out. But look, when you let them out, can I tell you from firsthand experience, you let them out, you step into who you really are. It's something I'm always trying to do in my writing now. I'm a mix of keto, carnivore, inspirational challenge. That's kind of my style now of what I do in my work. Because I feel like, and especially with what we've been through the last year and a half with everything happening in the world, people need that. People need to know there's hope, need to know there's something bigger in this life than just going through the day to day. It's bigger in this world than worrying about if you have fruit and honey in your diet. Like, that's first world problems. I'm sorry. It really is when it comes down to it. When there's kids killing themselves at 25% rate last year, suicide attempts, it really hits home. And you see that I could have been one of those people had I succumbed to it. And so you try to like speak up for those people that don't want to say anything.
How do you have people watch that content? And I'll give you context with that. So when I share videos on or podcasts or content on this is what you should eat on a meat-based diet, but then if I will throw in little seeds of here's disordered eating conversation, food addiction, here's like, I had one of the greatest social psychologists on about what makes your life happy. And he talks about all these wonderful studies. And they do poorly. But it's so near and dear to my heart that I don't care and I continue to share because I'm hoping it'll stick one day. But yeah. I don't know if it's like, do I not have the right audience or do people just not want to learn about that? Or, what has been...
It's the culture. The culture tells us if you're fat and sick, it's a diet problem. It's a movement problem. They don't talk about the outer edges of health. And look, when I started, there were taboo things that you weren't even talking. We didn't talk about real food when I first started. Now it's so ubiquitous and everybody talks about real food. But when you started, it's, just keep carbs low and da-da-da. And so things shift over time. Look, you and I might be trendsetters of talking about this kind of stuff. And it's funny, you said you had the happiness psychologist guy on. I had a happiness expert on my show as of like today when we're recording. That aired. And like, look, that's important stuff. And it's going to reach the right people. I do a podcast on Mondays called the One Step Deeper podcast with my best friend. She went through sexual abuse as a teenager, just like I went through physical and emotional abuse. And so we talk about real hard stuff. That podcast is doing phenomenal. Part of it is Brittany and I have a nice dynamic on there, but part of it is we talk about things that before you weren't even allowed to talk about. So yeah, a little bit of it is your audience expects you to talk about nutrition, but when they realize there's a connection with this mental health stuff to nutrition, then is when they'll have the buy-in factor.
Yeah. And I mean, I talk about it all the time, how stress and even unknown stress. So not only just if you have an illness in the body, but mental health, when you're stressed at your desk, fuming with anger and ruminating on thoughts, that all releases cortisol, right? So if we think about, well, is cortisol being excessively used by ketones or sugar? That's besides the point. When you think about mental health side, where we burn through so much cortisol. And that's why when we're stressed, our animalistic brain will want us to go and get some sugary foods to give us more energy to run from whatever is perceived threats or stress. And so it's really actually important in terms of nutrition and wellness to work on our core stressors. There was a practitioner I was talking to not too long ago that talks about some of her sickest patients never get better because their body is manifesting illness from really severe trauma in their past that they've never were willing to take care of, but are just kind of living life with it. But their body remembers that pain and figuring out how to survive with it. So it's starting to manifest all these diseases. And until they get to that core of the mental health, the trauma, that stress, they will never fully get better. And it doesn't really matter at that point what their diet is.
And see, thank you for articulating all that, Judy, because I think that's the next level. Everybody's like, what's the next diet trend, Jimmy? I said, dealing with your shit. That's the next trend. Like, because I don't think enough people that have those kinds of issues that get stuck really ever resolve those things until they resolve the trauma, resolve the kind of adverse event that happened in their life. And look, adverse events can happen all throughout your life, not just childhood. You could have had a wife suddenly die and it just left you in shambles. You could have a child die. You have any number of things, losing a job, pandemic, like all these things can like cause and trigger things in your body that but for those events happening would have never happened. And so if we don't deal with those, and by the way, I hired a life coach circa 2 years ago who's a licensed therapist, And I talked to her all throughout the last 2 years. Huge benefit, by the way. Highly recommend you try to find a therapist or a life coach who has some of that therapy training in their background, because she was amazing. She taught me about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, various little strategies to help deal with some of those head demons that I was dealing with. And I'm a far different person here now today than I was 2 years ago, when I felt like my world was kind of falling apart a bit. So highly, highly recommend you kind of deal with your stuff, because if you're stuck right now in your health and you've got the best practitioner like Judy Cho helping you out, trying to figure things out, and you're still stuck either in weight or inflammation markers or blood sugar, insulin is still kind of wackadoodle and you don't know why and it's inexplicable, look in your past. Something's going on. Something you're holding on to, and you don't even realize you're holding on to all that angst in your body. And you're right, that sympathetic nervous system, it rears its ugly head, and it ain't going to get better until you deal with it.
Absolutely. I'm totally in agreement. I mean, I suffer from eating disorder. And so I went into those intensive eating disorder facilities, and you would think it's all about the food, right? So they would educate you on food and what nutrient density is. They didn't talk about any of that. Sure, they said in a breakfast, you should at least have 2 carbohydrates and, things that I don't fully agree with, but the rest so I was there for about 10 hours every day, and 8 of those hours was focusing on, why are you using an eating disorder to cope, right? Is it mental health things? Is it a trauma from your past? Is it to feel like you fit in? Like, what is it? And it was a lot of group therapy, individual therapy, and it was about getting to know yourself. And then also with my psychology background, I think it's imperative to have a peace of mind, to then have your nutrition, dietary plans couple with that, to then really find healing. And I see it to hold true with my clients as well.
Yeah, it's so powerful. And it's something I wish I had done, quite frankly, at the beginning of my Atkins journey, because I would be so much further along. And I know it's why I still hold on to some weight. I'm finally getting to that other side of a lot of the mental stuff. And I'm about to embark on this 100-day plan that's going to include a lot of biohacks and things. But I'm in the right frame of mind. When I went away on my sabbatical 2 years ago, September 1st, 2019 was when I went away. My plan was to do what I'm about to do September 1st, 2021. But then life had a way of saying, oh, you think you're going to deal physically. Let's deal with that mental stuff first, Jimmy. And I found out things about my childhood trauma, and I had things fall apart in my personal life. And I needed to deal with all of that, so that now 2 years later, boom, I'm ready to do this physical thing that I am hopeful is going to make radical changes in my body.
And I mean, just from our faith, I really think God is using you too. You have such boldness and fierceness, and I think that's a very powerful thing that not a lot of people can do, especially in the social media space and the internet world of things. And I wonder if you had to go through your own trauma to then be able to show a holistic kind of way of healing. And you're probably the perfect person to do it. So I can see why it happened to you, as much as that's kind of negative, but you know what I mean? It's you're the perfect person to share and really evoke change. I mean, you changed my life, and now I'm giving back and helping other people hopefully change theirs, right? So I can see why God picked you.
It's phenomenal. It really has. And when I started that One Step Deeper podcast, I had no idea what the reaction would be. And it's been phenomenal. It's not as big as Live and Live Eat a Low Carb show by any means, but it's big for what it is, for being kind of outside my genre, not talking about nutrition at all on that show. And we still have a lot of people that listen and watch the show. I'm pretty darn proud of that.
Yeah. And even personally for me, when I see your posts occasionally, they're very inspiring, and it just gives me hope that there's ability for people to change and for the better.